Hey friend, hit subscribe, it's a second for you but huge for me. Leave a comment on the Revenge Veil channel with the city you're watching from. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you. My name is Carla Monroe. I'm 58, and for most of my life I trusted that family was a shelter you could always walk back into. I raised my daughter, kept the house in order, noticed the small things people miss, loose tiles, the way the porch light hummed in damp weather. And when Frank died last winter the house felt like a body with its breath gone. I sold the place we'd built in Everett because every floorboard and every outlet held his shape. My daughter Maya and her husband Ethan said there was room at their apartment in Northeast Everett, for a little while. I believed them. I arrived with 2 suitcases and most of my pride folded into a cardigan. I tried to be useful. I cooked dinners, I fixed a dripping cabinet without announcing it, I offered to pick up groceries. At first they accepted the favors like conveniences. Ethan treated me as if I were an extra appliance. He changed channels when I settled in to watch the news. Once as I walked past the hallway, he muttered "take her" under his breath. It stuck to me like cold lint. Maya pretended not to hear. "Work has been nuts," she'd say, eyes down, and that ended the conversation every time. The night it broke me, she stood beside Ethan while he announced at the table that they couldn't keep carrying my retirement. He said it like a fact. He said it like a sentence. I packed 2 suitcases while they finished dessert. I left without argument because I refused to give them the spectacle they wanted. I slept in a roadside motel that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, the vending machine in the hall swallowing my coins, the ceiling light humming like accusation. I texted Maya, "I love you." She didn't answer. Not that night, not for days, then weeks. When the money got thin and job applications returned polite rejections for fit or experience, I rifled through a cardboard box of keepsakes in the motel room and found my mother's diary beneath a stack of photographs. Her handwriting was the same slanted script that had filled birthday cards and scribbled notes in lunchboxes. One June entry stopped me cold. She wrote about a man, only his initials J.W., who'd visited and promised to arrange something if anything happened to him, to set aside a small provision to be delivered discreetly. I sat on the motel bed with the pages in my lap and the realization like a current under my feet. Maybe I wasn't simply discarded. Maybe there was a paper trail. I didn't call anyone right away. I wrote. I hand-addressed a careful letter to the attorney named in the diary, and mailed it with fingers that still remembered how to fold checks. 2 weeks later a voice with a composed, bookish tone answered my call. "I thought someone might get in touch," he said. He was Gregory Hale and he told me there was a file. He asked me to come to his office in Tacoma. I took the bus the next morning with a small bag and a head full of questions. His office smelled of old books and lemon polish. He placed a sealed envelope on the desk and said, "Open it when you're ready." Inside was a handwritten note from Jonathan Whitcomb, a name I'd seen in business profiles for decades. The letter admitted an affair, offered regret, and most important, spelled out instructions. If death claimed him first, a portion of assets, kept off the public estate, would be sent to her. There were account numbers, a trust name, and notarized pages that added up to just over $1 million. I sat very still and let the truth settle like rain. Money had always felt dangerous to me. In that moment it felt like a kind of choice. Back in Everett I rented a small short-term apartment downtown. The sort of tidy place Maya would never expect I could afford. I read up on trusts and LLCs, watched dry instructional videos, and learned the legal terms until they sounded like a second language. Then I found a tired apartment building listed for tax auction in the very neighborhood where Maya and Ethan lived. The auction was 2 weeks away. The thought arrived quietly, buy it. Not to humiliate, not for vengeance in a cartoon sense, but to hold the roof that sheltered them. I set up CM Holdings through a privacy trust, wired the funds, and bid at auction through a blind representative. I won without my name ever appearing in the county record. Suddenly I held the deed to the building over their heads. A month later tenant notices arrived. Updated lease terms, adjusted rent to bring units to market, and a schedule of necessary repairs. For Ethan the envelope landed like a blow. His emails exploded. Extortion. Scam. The kind of language meant to throw a man's pride into flames. Maya called for the first time in weeks, breathless. "Mom, something's happened with our rent," she said. I listened and let silence be my answer for a while. There was a slow, peculiar satisfaction in watching the man who had shoved me out scramble to steady himself. I did not raise a sign or shout from porches. I set a property manager to work. I signed legal documents under the company name. I ordered repairs, and I changed locks as required. I installed a small camera in the lobby for safety, and quietly reviewed maintenance reports. Repairs happened under CM Holdings, not under my given name. Maya called sometimes short, awkward apologies that never finished their sentences. Ethan began to post furious messages through the tenant portal, and to send angry emails to the management address. I forwarded each to my manager with a neutral note. Please apply standard policy. He replied with professional calm and no favors. Night after night I drove past the building and watched silhouettes behind curtains. Maya pacing, Ethan a shadow that shouted at one another on bad evenings. I didn't call. I kept learning patience. This was not about spectacle. It was about consequences that arrive slowly and eventually land where they must. I didn't call anyone. I folded the diary back into its cardboard cover and wrote instead, careful, deliberate, the way my mother used to write checks. I addressed the envelope to the attorney named in her last entry, sealed it, and mailed it with hands that remembered how to fold paper exactly. 2 weeks later my phone rang. Good morning, Mrs. Monroe, the man said in a voice that sounded like someone who kept paper in straight stacks. I'm Elliot Barnes. I'm the attorney mentioned here. If you can come by my office, I have records. He did not ask why. He only said a time. I took the early bus to Tacoma the next morning, carrying a small bag and a head full of tight questions. The city's air tasted of rain and diesel. Storefront reflections slid past in the window like small, indifferent mirrors. Mr. Barnes's office smelled of lemon polish and old leather. He sat behind a heavy desk and slid a sealed envelope across the wood with a quiet that seemed practiced. Open it when you're ready, he said. I slit the flap with fingernails that trembled a little and drew out a single folded page and several notarized documents. The page was a letter written in a hand I recognized from the photographs tucked inside family albums, tall, deliberate loops and slanted capitals. The signature at the bottom read Richard Beaumont. The letter read like a confession and a set of instructions all at once. He admitted an affair. He offered regret. Then he wrote in clinical, impossible sentences that if death found him first, a portion of assets, kept out of his public estate, was to be delivered to the woman named in his note. There were account numbers, a trust name, and a set of notarized pages that tallied to just over $1 million. I read the letter 3 times until the room stopped breathing, and all I could hear was the sound of my own pulse. Money had always felt like danger. In that instant it felt like a doorway. Back in Everett I rented a modest short-term apartment downtown, the sort of tidy place Maya would never expect me to afford. I spent nights with my laptop and a stack of printed guides, reading about trusts and privacy entities until the terms began to settle into meaning. I called a compliance officer Mr. Barnes recommended, and learned the blunt mechanics of privacy trusts and anonymous LLCs. I made lists on legal pads, which names to obscure, which filings to route through agents, which steps would leave no clear line back to me on county records. The work felt technical and not at all dramatic. Form after form, notarized pages, the slow movement of money inside institutional walls. Then I found the building. It was a tired 4-story brick complex in East Everett, the same neighborhood where Maya and Ethan had signed their lease. The county had scheduled a tax foreclosure auction in 2 weeks. The idea arrived quietly, like a thought that had been waiting to be noticed. Buy it. Not to humiliate, not to craft a headline. Buy the roof and pay for work that had been ignored. Hold where I could the responsibility for the shelter above them. I set up CM Holdings beneath a privacy trust. Mr. Barnes wired funds through the proper institutional channels, and arranged a third-party bidder to act on my behalf at the county auction. On the morning of the sale I sat in my car with a paper cup of coffee and the wrong sort of adrenaline, one that steadied instead of flaring. My representative made one silent phone call, placed a single bid, and the clerk's hammer fell. The title passed to CM Holdings. I had not shouted. I had not posted a threat. I had only by law and paper taken ownership. Felt surreal and precise. Over the next days I set in motion practical, unglamorous tasks. I hired a property manager who answered to CM Holdings and to no gossip, I scheduled inspection appointments and repair crews, and I drafted tenant notices in neutral language that a clerk could not twist into a scandal. I made the decisions in a small clinical office: choose a fair rent, schedule necessary repairs, order a new hot water heater for Unit 2B that tenants had been rationing for months. When the tenant notices landed in mailboxes and inboxes, Ethan's email erupted like a man struck. "This is extortion," he wrote to the management company. "This is fraud." He left heated voice messages at the office. Maya called me that night for the first time in weeks, her voice thinned. "Mom," she said, breathless, "there's a new lease and they're raising the rent." I did not answer with drama. I answered with a pause. I said, "Tell me what you need." I ordered the manager to apply standard policies across the board and to document every interaction. I forwarded Ethan's angry messages to Mr. Barnes with only the word "logged." He replied, "Preserve everything." There was a curious satisfaction in watching the man who had shoved me out scramble to steady himself, not because I desired his ruin, but because I wanted the ledger to show that the roof above people's heads was not a thing to be wielded as a threat. I did not stand on porches or orchestrate public scenes. I set a property manager to work, signed the checks under a company name, and arranged repairs that would make the place safer for everyone who lived there. Maya left messages that began with apologies and then broke off. Ethan posted furious demands in the tenant portal and sent a flurry of angry emails to the management address. I forwarded each to my manager with a simple instruction: "Please apply standard policy." The manager replied with professional calm and no favors. Night after night I drove by the building and watched small silhouettes behind curtains: Maya pacing in the living room, Ethan a shadow that burst into complaints on bad evenings. I did not call. I documented. I learned the language of patience, and I let the slow machinery of consequence do its careful work. I did not shout. I did not stage a scene. I hired a manager and kept my name out of files. I signed checks under CM Holdings and watched ink dry like small vows. The paint smelled of mineral spirits and old summers. The ladder scraped plaster and the stairwell filled with dust and the sound of work. I ordered a new hot water heater for Unit 2B. I scheduled a roof patch above the third-floor landing. I booked locksmiths to replace failing deadbolts. I installed a small camera in the lobby for safety. Nothing dramatic, a quiet black eye on the building. I asked the manager for weekly maintenance logs. He sent them in tidy emails. He wrote, "Completed. Heater replaced. Roof secured. Locks changed." I read each line like scripture. The tenants began to notice small things that make life easier. Mrs. Alvarez on 2B left a wicker basket of raisin cookies on my manager's desk. She said, "Thank you, Margaret. This place finally feels cared for." Mr. Carter in 4A asked for locked mailboxes. He whispered, "My pills went missing twice." I arranged secure boxes that week. The building softened in small increments. Lights stayed on in hallways at night. A welcome mat appeared by the entry. Neighbors started to trade names again instead of brief nods. That quiet change warmed something cold inside me. Ethan grew reckless. He phoned title companies pretending to be an attorney. He left voice messages at county offices with a practiced anger that sounded thin. He posted furious demands in the tenant portal. Caps lock fury, threats about government audits and fraud. He tried to bluff his way into records and failed. He printed fake forms and left them at the management desk. The forms looked amateurish. The clerk smiled politely and placed them in the circular file. He came to the office twice in 1 week, slamming the door as if force could open a locked record. He demanded a name and then accused the manager of lying. I asked the manager only for documentation. He replied, "I logged everything, Margaret. I will not be bullied." I forwarded Ethan's angry emails and voice messages to my attorney with one word in the subject line: logged. The attorney wrote back, "Preserve. Paper is patient. It holds memory when people do not." Maya called less and then more. Her messages were short and jagged. "Mom," she said once, voice thin, "we are fine." Then she cried and hung up. Once she stood for a moment on their stoop and watched a news van roll past. She texted a picture of a burnt noodle box. Cheap food on a cheaper night. I could feel the shape of her small, slow unraveling through a grocery cart. In late evenings I drove past the building and watched silhouettes behind curtains. I pressed my palm against the cold of the car window and memorized the angles of their life. Maya pacing. Ethan a restless shadow. Once I saw a light go out and then come back on, the small violence of a man trying to prove control. I did not intervene. I documented. I kept the camera footage private and the logs secure. I learned how to be methodical. My anger learned to breathe through forms and filings. The repairs changed daily life in subtle ways. The hot water heater meant a neighbor did not ration showers. The patched roof stopped the rain that had kept a ceiling light flickering for months. I watched small acts of dignity return to people I had barely known. A tenant left extra canned soup on the pantry shelf. A child left a drawing in the lobby. A crooked house with a sun and a single big heart. I kept that drawing folded in my wallet for weeks. Ethan's fury shifted to desperation. He tried to dig into trust paperwork by calling third-party vendors. He called title companies, asked for records, used fake credentials. He paid for a private investigator who knocked once at the manager's door, and then stopped returning emails when told the company held proper chain of title documents. He escalated in ways that were clumsy and loud. He texted Maya at 2 in the morning. He tried to corner her at work. He posted a long rant on a neighborhood forum that read like a man trying to convince himself. I did not retaliate. I let the paperwork do the work. When he tried threats, I collected them into a file. When he tried to humiliate, I preserved the record. That preservation felt like a weapon made of facts. One evening the maintenance log showed missed payments on their unit. A notice sat stamped and waiting to be mailed. I folded my hands and watched the slow machinery I had set in motion move toward a shape I could not take back. I felt no triumph, only a steady, cold certainty. The roof will stand. The rules will be the same for everyone. The consequence will land where it ought to land. The tenants' meeting notice smelled like printer ink and stale coffee. I arrived early, breathing rain and lemon polish on my coat. I sat near the back, hands folded, heart steady. The room was warm with bodies and nervous chairs. The property manager announced the renovation plan with a clipboard and a monotone. The manager said, "We appreciate investment from CM Holdings. Questions welcome." The room shifted. Eyes found me like small knives. Ethan pushed in late, jacket damp, face red with anger. Ethan said, "Who put you in charge? This is a lie." I stood. I walked forward without hurry. I said, "Good evening. I'm Carla Monroe. I own this building." Chairs scraped hard enough to make me flinch. A hush landed like silk. Ethan's jaw tightened. He sputtered something about extortion, about being tricked. Ethan said, "You're trying to ruin us." I said, "I do necessary repairs. I follow law and process." Tenants asked practical questions. Timing, noise, elderly needs. Mrs. Alvarez asked, "Will someone help with stairs for my mother?" I replied, "Yes. We will schedule work to protect residents." The conversation stayed small and useful. It did not become theater. Ethan paced and tried to bait a spectacle. He wanted a name to shout at. He wanted a show. He failed. The manager answered questions calmly and with receipts. The manager said, "All contracts are on record. We follow code." After the meeting, Ethan intercepted me in the lobby, voice lower and edged. Ethan said, "You think you taught me a lesson?" I looked at him levelly. I said, "You taught yourself how to show cruelty." His hand trembled when he reached for a retort. Maya stepped forward, voice thin and sharp. Maya said, "Stop, Ethan. This is not how we talk." Her words shook. For a moment she looked like the child I used to tuck in. After he left, she returned with a small folded book. Maya said, "I found this. It belonged to Grandma." She placed the diary on my palm. The pages slid under my thumb like old paper wings. I read the ink again in private that night. The diary opened spaces I had not expected. It named names with initials and dates like a map. It described laughter and late-night meetings and a promise to set aside money quietly. The revelation pulled threads in my chest. I slept poorly, the mattress a small raft in a steady sea. The next morning I walked to the kitchen and made coffee slow enough to listen. The plan tightened in my head like gears. The meeting gave me proof and presence. The diary gave me reason and route. I felt neither triumph nor malice, only a clear, cold clarity. The repairs would continue. The notices would stand. Paper would hold what anger could not erase. That night, as rain tapped the window, a new message flashed on my phone. It was from an unknown number. The text read, "You meddled where you shouldn't have." My chest closed. I watched the screen until the light dimmed. I saved the message to the archive folder. I felt the quiet of consequences gather like storm clouds. Maya admitted things in pieces, not all at once, not neatly. Maya said, "I don't know how I let him push you out." Her voice was thin and raw and full of surprise at herself. She told me about small compliances, saying yes to late nights, letting him check her phone, laughing when his jokes felt sharp. She said, "I thought I could handle him." I listened and tried not to stitch the shame to her skin. I said, "You stood with him." The words landed heavy and plain between us. She cried then, quick and fierce, and left the room to breathe. She came back hours later soaked by rain, hair clinging to her face like wet paper. Maya said, "He crossed a line. He followed me to work. He read my messages." She held a folded note in her hand that trembled. I helped her pack that night. She moved into a small studio across town the next week. The apartment manager later sent quarterly photos. The pictures showed neglect. Mold blooming in grout, a stack of unpaid mail by the door, lights dark for too many nights. The unit looked like a room losing its will to be lived in. I paid for movers to take her boxes, not to parade charity, but because weight lifts when shared. She started therapy and an art class with other women who painted like they were learning to speak again. Her first finished canvas was raw reds and black, a phoenix that looked angry and hopeful at once. She gave it to me. I hung it above my small mantle like a promise. Ethan escalated in public and private. Ethan sent veiled threats in emails and DMs, words that hinted at secrets but offered no proof. He posted insinuations on local groups, where neighbors like gossip instead of help. He faked filings and left plastic-looking notices at the management desk. I forwarded each message to Elliot Barnes with subject, "Logged." Elliot replied, "Preserve." We collected screenshots, recordings, and voicemails in a file like a slow, patient monument. The legal pressure changed his angle. He tried to humiliate and then he tried to vanish into noise. One day he left a short, furious message at the office. "You'll regret this." 2 days later he was gone. Maya found a note on the kitchen table. "I'm leaving town." The handwriting was spiky and small as though drawn by someone trying to shrink himself. Whether he fled or planned departure, the effect was the same, absence. She changed locks, and the first night she slept through without waking at a creak felt like a small miracle. I used half the proceeds from selling part of the holdings to seed a small emergency fund for women leaving crisis. I named a modest wing after my mother, simple plaque, a kettle, a threadbare couch that invited tired bodies to sit. The other half of the money bought a small house on a quiet street where oaks leaned like old friends. Moving boxes felt like closing a drawer that had jammed for years. We packed slowly, with pauses for coffee and small jokes that tasted like relief. Maya carried the last box and laughed at me when I burned a grilled cheese. She said, "You still can't cook that thing without catching it on fire." We laughed, the sound raw and grateful. For the first time in a long time we were allowed simple, small, foolish pleasures. The shelter wing opened quietly. No ribbon cutting, no press. Women came through with backpacks and tired eyes. I listened. I made tea. I signed checks. The work felt like stitches into a frayed world. Ethan's threats dissolved into rumor. The file we built sat thick and heavy on Elliot's desk, evidence that paper remembers what people try to forget. I did not celebrate his absence. I kept a careful calm. I wanted safety more than spectacle. I wanted a roof over heads and a small house with a porch that held morning sun. The Phoenix painting watched from above my mantle as I made lists, answered emails, and taught Maya how to replace a loose tile. We rebuilt with small things. New locks, a secure mailbox, a weekly grocery run that was solid and planned. I learned the steady language of doing. The wound did not vanish. It softened under habit and small kindnesses. At night I read my mother's diary again, and felt the loop of her handwriting like a hand laid on my shoulder. It reminded me that people can be careful and fierce at the same time. The quiet result of what I had done felt right. The landlord's ledger showed fairness. The repairs made life better for tenants beyond my daughter. Maya painted more, cried less, and began to speak without the habit of apologizing first. I began to sleep with the curtains open. One evening as we stacked the last box, Maya handed me a slice of grilled cheese on a paper plate, one edge blackened in loyalty to old habits. We sat on the porch steps and ate slowly while the sun leaned low. I said, "We did not make a spectacle." She said, "No, we made a life." The sound of our laughter folded into the street like a quiet victory. The trust closed with slow, lawful motions. I signed papers on a bright Thursday. The room smelled of printer toner and lemon polish. Elliot Barnes said, "All filings recorded." I watched signatures like small gates clicking shut. The final wire landed in our account that afternoon. The sound of the transfer felt oddly domestic. I wrote a check the same evening for the shelter wing. The paper felt good in my hand. I mailed it the next morning with a quiet sense of finish. Maya rebuilt herself in patient, clumsy steps. Maya said, "I started therapy last week." I replied, "Good. That matters more than words." She took an art class on Thursdays. She came home smelling of oil paint and turpentine. Her new canvas arrived with rough, hopeful strokes. She pressed it into my hands, bright reds and cautious golds. I hung the painting above my mantel the next day. The colors warmed the small room like a promise. Elliot sent the closing notice by certified mail. He wrote, "Trust dissolved. You may dispose of holdings as you choose." I sold part of the property to fund the shelter. I kept a modest share for myself. The sale had no press. There were no cameras, no celebratory photos. The legal quiet suited me. I never wanted spectacle. I wanted stable roofs and warm beds. Ethan tried one last time to make noise. He posted vague accusations on neighborhood threads. He messaged about hidden deals without evidence. Elliot replied with formal letters and cease and desist notices. I forwarded each new sliver of noise to the attorney. Elliot said, "We will close it down." And we did. The posts faded. Rumor dulled like radio static. The shelter wing opened in a rain-soft morning. Women arrived with duffel bags and tired eyes. I made tea and passed paper plates. I learned names: Jasmine, Rosa, Kim. Each woman carried a quiet map of small disasters. They told me stories in slow fragments. I filed intake forms and listened. I signed checks for bus tickets and warm coats. We bought a kettle and a second-hand sofa that sagged perfectly. The couch became a listening place. On the first night, a child hugged my leg like a seal of trust. I felt a tightening and then relief. This was the use of money I had wanted. Maya found small rhythms. She called me to read recipes aloud. Maya said, "Can you teach me how to plant tomatoes?" I replied, "Tomorrow. We will dig the beds together." We planted a row on my porch. The soil smelled like damp earth and sunlight. The first green tips surprised us both. I watered them in the evenings and watched the sun catch small new leaves. The act was holy and mundane. The diary stayed on my bedside table. I read my mother's looping script by lamplight. Her words felt like a hand passed across generations. She had written about quiet plans and private promises. Her handwriting taught me to be deliberate and careful. Sometimes I read the entries aloud. I said, "Grandma said this." Maya would nod and listen, the words helping stitch old shame into new practice. Ethan's name drifted less through our days. He became rumor and then a blank where noise used to live. Once, a neighbor mentioned he had left town. That was enough. We changed locks. We slept through the kind of night that used to fracture into small alarms. I learned to let go of the cold attention his presence demanded. At dusk I sat on the porch and read. The tomatoes glinted like coins in the sun. The air smelled of cut grass and distant dinners. I filled small boxes for the shelter with toiletries and socks. I labeled them neatly and felt the rightness of order. The money had bought tidy things. Locks that did not rattle, heaters that would not fail in January, kitchen utensils for women who had nowhere else to put them down. The small returns mattered. Maya's art deepened. She sold a few paintings at a local cafe and bought better brushes. When she came home, she smelled faintly of coffee and conversation. She would say, "I met a woman who used to teach ceramics." I replied, "Hold on to people like that." She learned to make plans that did not include apology as the first clause. I planted more than tomatoes. I planted a quiet life. I learned that money could be a tool and not a trap. I learned to use paper as a safeguard and kindness as armor. I no longer expected dramatic justice. I wanted steady correction. I wanted to build spaces where women could rest. The ledger I kept was full of small purchases and receipts. Each entry felt like a stitch in a repaired garment. Some nights I opened the diary and felt my mother's breath in the looped letters. She had passed on a way to act without fury. She had passed on a way to be patient and precise. I folded her pages carefully and slid them into the drawer beside the bed. The drawer now held plans, contacts, and a small wooden thimble she once used on sewing nights. On an ordinary Tuesday, I paid the last invoice for the roof repairs. The men who had fixed the shingles waved as they left the street. A child ran by with a red kite. A neighbor watered a pot on her stoop. The building felt less like a ledger of pain, and more like a place where lives continued. I never shouted in court. I never took a microphone. Instead, I paid debts and wrote checks and opened doors. The quiet justice felt cleaner to me than any headline. If anyone asked what I wanted, I told them plainly. Not spectacle but balance. Not vengeance but a roof that does not leak. We ate grilled cheese on my porch that evening. Maya burned one side, exactly the way she had when she was a child. We laughed and chewed slowly while the summer light thinned. The painting above the mantel watched us like a bright, stubborn sun. The shelter wing hummed softly down the block. The tomatoes grew. The diary rested in the drawer like a small compass. I could feel the shape of life bending toward something steadier. Morning smelled like toast and rain on our small porch. Maya said, "I burned it, Mom. Old habit." I said, "You always did the corners like that." We laughed, small and sudden. I held the diary, pages thin and cedar-scented. Elliot wrote by email. Trust dissolved. Filings recorded. I read it aloud. I said, "It is finished. Papers signed today." Maya said, "Does it feel different?" I paused, listening to coffee steam. I said, "It feels steadier. Not loud, just right." She wrapped her hands around the mug. The shelter opened this morning, quiet and warm. A woman named Jasmine hugged a blanket close. Jasmine said, "Thank you. We needed this." I said, "You are welcome. Sit. Have tea." Rosa smiled and mended a child's sock at the table. Kim asked for bus tickets and I wrote them down. Maya said, "They need a kettle." I nodded and called for one. The phoenix painting watched from above our mantel. Maya said, "It looks like hope, not anger." I said, "That was the idea." The tomatoes on the porch pushed up green and stubborn. A neighbor waved from across the street and called my name. I replied, "Hello. We are doing okay." Rumor about Ethan thinned into nothing. A neighbor said, "I heard he left town." I said, "Good. Let him go." Night came soft and the porch light blinked. I folded the diary closed and slid it into the drawer. Maya said quietly, "Do you ever want to shout?" I said, "Sometimes, but I choose steady instead." She rested her head on my shoulder and breathed out. I said, "We built something small and true." Maya laughed and burned the edge of her grilled cheese again. She said, "Some things never change." I said, "Good. Let them be our small jokes." If you like this story, hey friend, hit subscribe. It's a second for you but huge for me. Leave a comment on the Revenge Veil channel with the city you're watching from. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you. Now let's get back to the quiet story of ordinary courage.